And welcome students to the start of our animation course. We are going to kick things off right away by talking about pixel art. Now, if you're not familiar with what pixel art is simply two-dimensional animation that is made by using pixels. We have an example of it right here. This is a very simple image made by a student that I have had in my class before of an image comprised of pixel art. Now, what is a pixel is simply just a very basic unit that represents an image at its most fundamental level. So if we look here, this image, and you can see it maybe at the bottom of the screen, is 600 by 400 pixels. What does that mean? Well, that means that this image is 600 pixels wide by 400 pixels tall. Now, of course, there is different attributes that go into image, like we'd have different things that we can do to simulate things like shading and color and stuff like that. But an image that's made in pixel art does not have to be restricted necessarily by size. So for example, this image is, as I said, 600 by 400, but then I have another image over here that is much smaller. This is an 8 by 8 pixel. Now, of course, this is a little small here, so I'm using a magnification lens to zoom this in. And you can see that this is a much simpler image, but it is still pixel art. Its size might be 8 pixels by 8 pixels, but you can get a lot of data for an image put into that small space. Now, one thing I do want to point out is even though this is 8 by 8 pixels, you can still see that this is very basic to represent a tree. We can tell that this is a tree, and there's some shading effects and stuff like that go on in order to actually give this image some dimension. Now, I do want to point out, of course, that each one of these little blocks here that you see in this image is a representation of 1 pixel. So when we start talking about an image size and we say, okay, this is at 8 by 8 or this is 16 by 16, etc., that is referring to these blocks here. Now, each of these blocks, each pixel, can only ever be 1 color. I can't take a pixel and cut it in half, for example, and do a half pixel that's maybe green and blue. No, it all has to be 1 color. So whenever we're dealing with pixel art, each one of these blocks is always going to be 1 color. And of course, because it's 1 color, that does restrict you a little bit in certain things that you can do. Now, if we look, of course, at a much bigger image like we had over here with the 600 by 400, you can see that we have a lot more detail. But if I were to zoom in on this image here and go much closer, you can see that these little squares exist here too, and you can see that they are comprising of different colors. So you can see in here we have different shades of green, different shades of blue, and of course we are using those in this image to comprise a much larger representation of something. So that's just a quick introduction to what pixel art is. Again, it's just a art that's made using pixels, and that's how we're going to start this class off. Now, of course, we will get into some more advanced techniques as we move into the course. I'm not going to expect you to be able to jump right in and make this right off the go. If you can, that's great. But before we do that, we're going to start with something a lot more simpler for us to actually make pixel art. And the tool that we're going to be using for that is called Photoshop. Now, let's of course assume that you don't know what Photoshop is. So in that next lesson, we're actually first going to take a quick crash course through some of the things in Photoshop so that way you can get familiar with what we're going to be working with.